LMAO, they called you crazy, laughed behind your back, whispered that you'd lost it. Funny thing is, while they were busy labeling you, you were watching, listening, learning. Every reaction they gave you, data, every insult, confirmation. You never needed their approval. You needed their patterns. They thought you were spiraling. Turns out you were running long-term psychological operations, quietly flipping the board, rewiring the game, and letting them expose themselves one move at a time. They mocked your silence like it was weakness, like quiet meant empty, like stillness meant fear. They needed noise to feel alive, needed to talk, explain, justify, overreact. You didn't. You let the room fill with their voices while you stayed unreadable. That's what scared them first. Humans hate mirrors that don't reflect back. So they laughed. They poked. They tried to pull a reaction out of you like kids shaking a box to see what's inside. And every time you gave them nothing, they assumed you had nothing. Silence isn't absence. Silence is space. Space to watch how people expose themselves when they think they're in control. You noticed who talks when nervous, who jokes when threatened, who gets loud when they feel small. You saw patterns repeat, egos flare, lies stack on top of each other. They thought you were zoning out, detached, lost in your own head. You were mapping their behavior like a blueprint. Timing, tone, micro expressions, inconsistencies. The pauses between their words said more than the words ever could. They underestimate quiet people because silence doesn't beg for validation. It doesn't perform. It waits. And waiting drives impulsive minds insane. The louder they got, the more predictable they became. They filled the silence for you. Volunteered information, revealed intentions, showed their pressure points without you asking a single question. They confused your restraint with confusion. Big mistake. You understood early that the fastest way to control a room is to let everyone else talk first. Mockery was their defense mechanism. If they labeled you strange, distant, crazy, they wouldn't have to admit they didn't understand you. People insult what they can't read. They needed a story where you were behind because the alternative was terrifying, that you were ahead and just waiting. So they joked about you, turned your calm into a punchline. But jokes are just confessions disguised as laughter. Every laugh was nervous energy leaking out. You learned how power shifts when someone stops reacting, how fragile confidence becomes when it isn't being fed. They tested boundaries, expecting resistance, drama, explosion. You gave them neutrality. That neutrality forced them to escalate. And escalation always reveals intent. You watched alliances form and fracture, saw who followed, who needed approval, who folded under pressure. You never interrupted the process. You let it unfold naturally, like a controlled experiment. Silence made them project. They assumed motives, invented narratives, assigned emotions you never had. That was useful. Projection is a window into the mind. When they said you were plotting, it meant plotting was something they would do. When they said you were dangerous, it meant they feared being exposed. You didn't correct them. Why would you? Let them write their own psychological profile out loud. While they burned energy trying to decode you, you conserved yours. While they reacted, you recorded. While they fought over moments, you focused on trajectories. Silence gave you leverage because it removed you from their emotional economy. You weren't buying what they were selling. You weren't trading attention for approval. You stayed outside the loop, and that's where the real information lives. By the time they realized your silence wasn't emptiness but control, it was already too late. They had shown you everything. Their limits, their habits, their weaknesses. They trained you without knowing it. Every interaction sharpened your understanding. You didn't need to dominate the conversation to dominate the outcome. You let them underestimate you all the way into their own exposure, all the way into revealing the moves they'd make when pressure hit, all the way into handing you the advantage they thought you never had, all because you stayed quiet long enough for the truth to get uncomfortable and start talking on its own. What they called madness was just patience stretched beyond their attention span. See, people panic when results don't show up fast. They want proof, applause, feedback loops every 5 minutes to reassure themselves they exist. You didn't play that game. You were fine looking irrational to people who think short term. Fine being misunderstood by minds that can't sit with uncertainty. To them, patience feels like insanity because it forces them to confront their own impatience. They watched you take losses without reacting, absorb hits without exploding, move slowly when everyone else was sprinting. That confused them. In their world, smart looks fast, loud, visible. Strategy is supposed to announce itself. They couldn't comprehend that someone could be calm while the clock kept ticking. So they labeled it crazy, delusional, out of touch. Labels are shortcuts for people who don't want to think too hard. Calculated patience doesn't look impressive in the moment. It looks like stagnation, like you're behind, like you missed your chance. That's why it works. While they were busy chasing quick wins, you were studying systems. While they celebrated temporary victories, you were watching what those victories cost them. Energy, focus, credibility. They burned fuel to feel important. You conserved it to stay dangerous. They mistook your lack of urgency for lack of direction. They couldn't see the long arc because they live inside the next reaction. You understood that timing beats speed, that pressure reveals structure, that people make their worst decisions when they think nothing is happening. So you waited, not passively, intentionally, waiting while variables aligned, waiting while overconfident players exposed their tells, waiting while noise drowned out clarity. Patience gave you distance. Distance gave you perspective. Perspective gave you control. You weren't emotionally invested in every moment, so you weren't blinded by it. They were trapped inside their impulses, mistaking motion for progress. You let them rush ahead and trip over their own momentum. Every shortcut they took created a weakness you quietly noted. They thought you were stuck because you didn't announce your moves. They didn't understand that real planning happens offstage. They needed reassurance that something was happening. You didn't. You trusted the process because you designed it. And when doubt crept in, you didn't outsource it to the crowd. You sat with it, tested it, refined it. That alone separated you from them. Calculated patience means knowing when not to act, knowing when silence does more damage than confrontation, knowing that reacting too early gives away your hand. They were impulsive because impulse feels powerful. You were restrained because restraint is power. They swung wildly, hoping something would land. You aimed once, knowing exactly where it would hit. The irony is, their impatience worked in your favor. They exposed themselves trying to force outcomes. They escalated when nothing happened. They made mistakes just to break the tension. You let them. You let time apply pressure while you stayed steady. Time always sides with the patient because impatience leaks information. Frustration creates errors, and errors compound. By the time results appeared, they felt sudden to everyone else. Overnight success, unexpected shift. They never saw the years of restraint behind it. They never connected the dots because they stopped watching once they decided you were irrelevant. That was the gift. Being dismissed buys you freedom. Freedom to move without interference. Freedom to build without sabotage. What they mocked as madness was simply you refusing to dance to their rhythm. You moved on a longer timeline, one they couldn't perceive, and by the time they realized patience wasn't passivity but preparation, the board had already changed. The rules had already shifted, and every rushed decision they made along the way had quietly stacked the odds in your favor while you waited, adjusted, recalibrated, and smiled to yourself knowing that the loudest people never notice the moment they lose until it's already been decided, and all that's left is for reality to catch up with what you understood from the beginning. From the beginning, that time doesn't reward the frantic, it rewards the precise, and you were never crazy, you were just willing to wait longer than they were willing thin, or willingzy. We're just willing way longer than we're willing to think. Every emotional reaction they gave you was a confession wrapped in a feeling. Anger, jealousy, sarcasm, fake laughter, sudden silence. None of it was random. Most people think emotions are messy, uncontrollable things that just happen. That belief alone makes them readable. You didn't get emotional about their emotions. You studied them. You treated every reaction like raw data spilling out in real time. When they got angry too fast, you learned where their ego lived. When they laughed too loud, you learned what threatened them. When they dismissed you casually, you learned they were trying to convince themselves. People reveal their hierarchy of fears through emotion. What triggers them shows you what they protect. What they overreact to shows you where they're insecure. You didn't argue with their feelings. You archived them. They thought you were sensitive because you noticed everything. They thought you were affected because you remembered patterns. They didn't realize awareness isn't vulnerability. It's leverage. While they were busy feeling, you were decoding. Tone shifts, timing changes, energy spikes. Those are tells. Emotional people can't help but broadcast their internal state. They leak truth through behavior, even when their words are polished. You let them vent, let them rage, let them brag, let them spiral. Every emotional outburst was a map of their inner structure. You saw who needed validation, who feared being ignored, who collapsed under pressure, who became cruel when cornered. Emotion stripped away their mask faster than logic ever could. And you never interrupted the process. You didn't soothe them. You didn't escalate. You observed. They assumed emotions were weapons they could use against you. Guilt, intimidation, sympathy, praise. They tried all of it. But you didn't react the way they expected. That confused them. Emotional manipulation only works on people who respond emotionally. You responded analytically. You noticed patterns instead of absorbing feelings. Their tactics became transparent once you saw which emotion they reached for under stress. Fear made them reckless. Confidence made them sloppy. Jealousy made them obsessive. Relief made them careless. You learned how to read these shifts like weather patterns. You could tell when pressure was building long before it exploded. You could tell when someone was about to make a mistake because their emotions stopped matching their words. That mismatch is where truth lives. They thought emotions made them human and you cold. They didn't understand that detachment doesn't mean absence of feeling. It means control over it. You felt everything. You just didn't let it drive. You let it inform. That difference changed everything. While they were inside the storm, you were tracking its movement. Every reaction added to your understanding. Who panicked when ignored? Who needed dominance? Who folded when challenged? Who pretended not to care while caring the most? Emotional reactions are habits, and habits repeat. Once you saw the loop, you could predict the outcome. Not because you manipulated them, but because they were consistent. They accused you of overthinking, of reading too much into things. That's what people say when they don't like being seen clearly. You weren't guessing, you were correlating. Patterns don't lie. Emotional reactions repeat under similar conditions. You tested it quietly, applied pressure, removed attention, changed variables, watched responses. The data held. You learned when to stay silent because anger was about to surface, when to speak because insecurity would spike, when to step back because ego needed space to self-destruct. You weren't reacting to people. You were timing them. Their emotions told you when to move and when to wait. They thought emotions made them unpredictable. In reality, emotions made them mechanical. Push the right button, get the same response. Again and again. You never needed to force outcomes. You just needed to understand inputs. That's how every emotional reaction became intelligence. Not gossip, not drama, not personal. Strategic awareness harvested from people who couldn't stop telling on themselves every time they felt something too strongly to hide. They lived in the moment like it was the only thing that existed. Every win had to be immediate. Every loss felt like the end of the world. Short-term minds are addicted to urgency because urgency makes them feel important. You weren't impressed by that. You saw how reactionary thinking keeps people trapped in loops, fighting the same battles with different faces, mistaking motion for progress. While they were obsessed with the next move, you were designing the last one. Long-term thinking scares people because it removes emotional payoff. There's no applause for patience, no dopamine hit for restraint, so they avoid it. They chase quick reactions, quick validations, quick dominance. You understood that reacting gives away control. The person who controls the timeline controls the outcome. So you stepped out of their tempo and created your own. They reacted to everything: insults, praise, rumors, setbacks. Each reaction pulled them further off course. You watched them burn energy responding to things that didn't matter. You watched them exhaust themselves proving points no one would remember. You refused to be dragged into that cycle. You measured impact, not emotion. You asked one question they never did: does this matter in a year? While they were busy winning arguments, you were positioning. While they were fighting fires, you were studying why the building was designed to burn. You didn't need to dominate conversations to dominate outcomes. You needed consistency. Small, deliberate actions stacked over time. They underestimated compounding because compounding is invisible at first. That's why it works. Short-term thinkers chase certainty. Long-term planners tolerate ambiguity. You sat comfortably in the unknown while they panicked for clarity. You let situations unfold instead of forcing conclusions. That patience allowed reality to reveal itself. People show who they are over time. Systems expose their flaws eventually. You trusted that process more than impulse. They thought you were slow because you didn't rush to respond. They thought you were weak because you didn't strike back immediately. They didn't see the cost of their speed. Every rushed reaction narrowed their options. Every emotional response committed them to a path they couldn't undo. You kept your options open. Flexibility is power when time is on your side. You planned backwards. You envisioned outcomes before actions. You understood that the endgame determines the opening moves. While they reacted to what was happening, you prepared for what would happen next. That gave you asymmetry. You weren't playing the same game. They were sprinting laps. You were changing the finish line. Short-term thinking makes people loud. Long-term thinking makes people invisible. Invisibility gave you freedom. Freedom to test ideas without interference. Freedom to fail privately and adjust. Freedom to grow without being targeted. They ignored you because you weren't reacting. That neglect was the greatest advantage you could have asked for. They mistook your calm for lack of ambition. They didn't see the internal discipline it takes to delay gratification, to let opportunities pass because they weren't aligned, to say no to wins that would cost you later. You understood that not every battle is worth fighting, and not every victory is worth taking. When the shift finally happened, it felt sudden to them. Out of nowhere. Unfair. They never noticed the quiet accumulation of advantage, the small decisions, the avoided traps, the patience under pressure. They only saw the outcome, not the years of positioning behind it. They stayed reactive, stuck in cycles of urgency and burnout. You stayed deliberate, moving with intent across a longer horizon. And by the time they realized the game wasn't about winning moments, but controlling direction, you were already operating in a different phase entirely, watching them exhaust themselves chasing reactions while you advanced steadily toward an outcome that had been inevitable the moment you stopped thinking in days and started thinking in years.